So I want to talk a little bit about this whole subject of theosophy in daily life. I'm of the opinion that the genuine value of a thing, it's something that it's very wonderful for us to have profound concepts. It's very wonderful to have the sort of dynamic systems of thought that have been developed through the Theosophical Society's work and through the reintroduction of what we experience as contemporary theosophy. But at a certain point, unless these sorts of things that we know as theosophy are translatable into the world in which we live from moment to moment, then it falls into that very large pile of things that are interesting, but perhaps not useful, or perhaps no longer useful. So I think it's worth considering how and where this thing that we call theosophy fits in to the moment-to-moment living that we each have. So on our way to that, just tell you a little bit of a story about somebody many years ago. I had the very good fortune to be around someone who was widely regarded as a very profound representative of Tibetan Buddhism. He was a Rinpoche, which, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Tibetan system, anyone with the title Rinpoche, basically it means someone who is a reincarnated high teacher, someone who has done very profound things in the service to the Dharma in some previous lifetime. I can remember the first time I encountered the term, I was ignorant, and I was at some special ceremony that the Dalai Lama was doing, and they gave a program. And on the program, they listed the names of many of the people who were active. And I looked through the program, and there was this whole it was like James Smith and Dr. Bill Johnson. And then you had this whole list of people who were named, Tubten Rinpoche, so-and-so Rinpoche, somebody else Rinpoche. And I was thinking, again, ignorantly, I said, well, this must be like the name Jones or the name Smith in America. There's just so many of these people in Tibet named Rinpoche. It was only later that I found out the meaning of the title. But this gentleman he actually was staying with me at my home. He had come to Chicago to deliver a series of teachings on this core teaching in Tibetan Buddhism about love and compassion. He was an old man at the time that he came to stay there, and I would drive him. Every day we would have time at my home, and then we would have time driving to this destination where he was giving his teachings. And along the way, he shared some of his story with me. And it turns out that he was one of these lamas, he was one of these teachers in Tibet who at the time in 1959, when the Dalai Lama left and so many other thousands left Tibet with him, he stayed behind. And that was something that really worked to his disadvantage, in the sense that by staying behind, he then was one of those ones that was imprisoned. And part of his imprisonment was also this serious form of what was called, particularly during the Cultural Revolution in China, re-education. He had to be re-educated out of these medieval superstitions, which would have been any religious belief. So part of this re-education process he described was this. From day to day, he would get up and he would be led out of the place where he was imprisoned, and there would be a circle of people, and they would just walk him around the circle. And each one, as he came up to him, they could slap him, they could hit him, they could kick him. It was a form of torture. And all of this was about renouncing and changing his set of beliefs. He had been someone who had been a practitioner for all of his life. And so for him, he found himself in this situation, so now what do? You can't get out. So his thought was, what do I do with my mind to address this extremely challenging situation that I find myself in now. And so what he did was he reverted to the various practices that were involved in his training. And as a tantric monk, one of the things that was part of his training was this. He had had many initiations. And in that particular tradition, what happens is that it enables you to arise, to appear as one of these deities. So he said he tried that. So when they let him out, in consciousness, he arose as particularly this one terrifying sort of deity, Yamantaka. And so when he walked around the circle on that particular day, as they struck him, it wasn't him that was being struck, it was Yamantaka. And Yamantaka was, this god is said to be so terrifying that even the gods run when he comes around. So he walked around the circle with that. And then he would analyze the results in the evening. And he found that while it provided him some level of distraction from what was going on, it was not effective. He tried other deities. Then he tried meditational techniques of trying to abstract his consciousness from the body so that the body was being beaten, but the mind somehow remained free. So anyway, what he shared and what became so meaningful to me was this, that out of all of these different practices, he said that the one thing that he found that was most effective, and he was imprisoned for many, many years. The one thing he found that was most effective was the practice of love and compassion toward his persecutors. This was the thing that was enabled him to get through these sessions in a way where he came out of it undamaged inwardly. The idea that, in reincarnation practices, the idea is that each one of us are connected intimately, and that we have been reborn so many times. This is the Buddhist point of view. There have been so many rebirths that each one of us has at some point been in the position of being the mother to every other. So when you have that sort of mindset, and you see someone, and when you walk in front of him, he strikes you or he spits on you, in his mind, the transition that he made was, if this were my mother, would I hate her? Would I try to destroy her? Or would I recognize that in this particular moment, something has happened in her mind, and she's just temporarily insane? And he got through it with that. So I say that because hopefully the daily lives that we encounter, those aren't the sort of challenges that we will have to meet. But the idea that I came away from it with is that if there is a spiritual teaching that we embrace, if it's something that can apply at every single level, then it's real. And so we need to discover what that is. You have similar examples in the sorts of books that we read, the scriptures of the world. The Bhagavad Gita. This is one of these situations where Arjuna had a very clear-cut problem in his daily life that he had to face. His problem was that a war was getting ready to start. Heads were going to roll. People were going to pass. And his problem was that on both sides, he had people who were dear to him. His enemies, the ones he was lining up to fight against, were people who had been his teachers, his friends, his mentors. And so for him, his struggle was now, what is it in my thinking, in my training, what can I draw upon to respond to this? And he had nothing. The first chapter of the Bhagavad Gita is the despondency of Arjuna. He became despondent. And he just bleated out, just sobbed out his problems to his charioteer, who just happened to be Lord Krishna. And so based on that, we have the teachings that came from the Bhagavad Gita about how action and inaction, and that we're always acting, and that there are very necessary ways that we have to adjust our minds in order to make choices that end up being called something that can be said to be wise. So this is something that's constantly in play. Whether we find it in scriptures, whether we find it in other people's lives, but most importantly, whenever we find it in our own lives. So, since I'm going to be talking a little bit about theosophy in daily life, it probably would help us if we talked a little bit about what daily life actually is. And we saw a wonderful video clip that Damon showed last night that had one particular segment. It was a commencement address to a bunch of college students who were just getting ready to step out into the world, and this person was telling them about how their daily life is about to change. You know, college has been difficult, but now wait for the boredom that has yet to come. That was the way he described it, this repetitive chain of events that they're getting ready to step out into. That's one approach. But, you know, what do we mean by daily life? And each one of us has that thing that we call our life, and it's composed of a number of different things. In the morning, afternoon, evening, we feed ourselves. We choose particular sorts of foods to give nutrition to the body. We're constantly in the process of selecting the books we want to read, the movies we want to see, the music that we will listen to affect our mood, our emotions, our thoughts. I don't know how they arrive at this figure, but there is the idea that every single day, every one of us thinks an average of 20 to 70,000 different thoughts. You people have some busy minds. 20 to 70,000 thoughts a day. And of course, that's not talking about how many of them we're actually aware of, because many of them are just passing through. 20 to 70,000 thoughts a day. So this is all going on in everyone's daily life. Also, simultaneously with that, we have moments of uplift, moments where we suddenly know things in ways that are not perhaps explicable along normal channels. We intuit, and all the while, we also find ourselves asking questions. Questions like, who am I in the midst of all of this? Is there some sort of meaning in all of this activity? Is there a purpose? Why am I here? What's all this for anyway? Is it just a meaningless temporary event? So this is like everyone finds themselves every day engaged in some portion of the spectrum of activity. That's just the nature of daily life. So within each of us this is going on, but then we ask again, if this describes daily life, are all daily lives the same? I mean, is the doctor, the male doctor in the London hospital, is his daily life the same as the woman farmer in Indonesia? Is the child soldier in the Congo, is his life the same as the Buddhist monk in Bhutan? Are the immigrants crowding at the Eurotunnel, their daily life, is it the same as the theosophist sitting in a convention? On and on and on. Are all daily lives the same? And I think what it comes back to is that really there are countless different things that are going on. And at the same time, another sort of dividing line that we might put in. What about age? Even if someone shares the exact same circumstance, but they're 15, Is theirs the same as their grandfather? So you get the point. In Indian culture, they had a system that I think really relates to not only common sense, but to actual human experience. And it was spoken of as the 4 ashramas of life. You know, the 4 different stages of life. And based on the stage of life, that determined the sort of activity that was the natural expression for a human being. So you had the Shravaka stage, or the stage of youth. And in youth, what that involves is listening and learning. Shravaka is actually just the hearer, the listener. So in youth, the idea is that you absorb, you listen, you learn. The next ashrama was the stage of the householder. So after you've learned a little bit, now it's time to go out there and get into life, make your way, make your family, get a job, you know, do all of those wonderful things that occupies this portion of a life. And that's the second. But then came another stage. You know, there was the third of these ashramas where someone was expected, having raised their families, having provided for everyone, now the time to continue working is through. And now reaches the stage of life when you actually retire from all of this. You know, the forest dweller was the stage that came out of that. And so, even though everybody didn't go to the forest, some did, but the idea was that this is a time where you actually focus your thoughts on the inner life and the higher life, and try to make those sorts of connections that will be meaningful from that stage forward. Some very few went on to this 4th ashrama, this 4th stage, which was when they renounce everything, the renunciant. That's the one who has no possessions, no ties to family. It's all something that's behind them at this stage. Actually, in the life of the story of the life of the Buddha, that phase where he has his sort of prior to his awakening, when he's still a happy prince living in the kingdom, he had that experience of seeing, going out of the kingdom and seeing somebody who was sick. He had never seen that before, and he wondered about it. He saw someone who was old. He'd never seen an old person, and he wondered about it. He saw someone who was dead, and that set him on his quest. But he had a problem, because he was a very young man. And so when he went to talk to the wise people about, I'm going to just leave everything behind because I realize that I have to get the answers to death, old age, and illness. And every single person, the wisest of people, told him, no, don't do that. And their reasoning was not because it's not something that you do, not because it's not something that must be done, but because it's too soon for you. You're out of cycle. You are not yet in that stage. So there's this idea that there are all of these various separations that go into a daily life. And yet, you have something like the Theosophical Society, whose motto is, there is no religion higher than truth. You know, truth is that thing which, if it is actually true at all, must necessarily be true in every situation. If it's just situational, if it's true, you know, here while we're together, but when we walk outside the door it's not, I don't think you'd call that truth. You might call it, you know, a workable arrangement or something else, but it's not truth. So there is no dharma. Actually, it's translated as there is no religion higher than truth, but actually it is there is no dharma higher than truth. Satyam Paronasti Dharma. Did I say that right? Was my accent and inflection okay? I'm not talking to the experts. So there is no Dharma that is higher than truth. And Dharma has a range of meanings, of which religion is one, but not only religion. I mean, part of the basis of the caste system in ancient India was the idea of Dharma, the idea that's expressed in the Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna when he's having his woes about, I can't fight. Krishna says to him, you must fight. Your Dharma requires it. So what's this Dharma that cannot be higher than truth? And so essentially, Dharma is translated sometimes as religion, sometimes it's translated as that body of truths that lead to enlightenment. Sometimes it's translated as duty. One's Dharma is one's duty. But why? Why is it that you can say that someone is born and they have a particular Dharma in this life? And so really, this word Dharma in many ways speaks about composition. You have a particular path in life. You have a particular duty that you must perform because you are composed in a certain way. The materials that make up your being are of a certain balance that it predisposes you in a certain direction. And so by virtue of that, this is in fact your duty. And to act otherwise would be to act against the composition of your being. So there is no Dharma, there is nothing that's higher than truth. So in our thinking, in our consideration of this, probably because we're Theosophists, we place a very high value and give very high regard to knowledge. We are people of the book. We believe, like many, that knowledge is power. And so knowledge is that thing that seems to separate us one from another. Recently, I found myself kind of repeating this particular phrase. I think when you talk to groups of people, sometimes it ups your stature when you quote important people. So I won't miss this opportunity to up my stature. And particularly if you talk about scientific or contemporary things, if you want to take a big bump up, you talk about Albert Einstein. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Albert Einstein. He had a quote. He said it, other people said similar things. But you've probably all run across it. What he said was this, and I find it profound. He says, no problem can be solved on the level of consciousness that created it. No problem can be solved at the level of consciousness where that problem was created. And so if we take the examples, in the world today, I'm not telling anybody anything that they don't know if I tell you that there are some very, very profound issues and crises that are facing us as a humanity living on the planet in the year 2015. I'm not giving away any secrets if I tell you that. Anybody who vaguely pays attention to the news or even is vaguely sensitive, you become aware that there are very strong currents flowing and that there's a deep sort of imbalance in many directions in our world today. The obvious things, the obvious symptoms are such things as the imbalance that we talk about when we speak of pollutions. The earth, the air, the water, all of it is being quite systematically polluted by our human behaviors. Sort of a new thing. It didn't exist a couple of 100 years ago. but it's something that's accelerating. We know that if you look at a map of the globe, deserts are spreading where there once was fertile land. I was in Tibet in 2008 or 9, I forget now, and they took us to see this great glacier that wasn't there. I mean, it used to be this glacier, and you'd go to this spot, and this huge mound of ice that had been there for thousands of years had receded to the point that by the time we got there, you'd have to go much, much higher to even see it. So that's happening. The climate change, we're aware of that. We're aware of economic sorts of imbalances on the planet, human created, of course. And everywhere you look, there are wars going on. If you Google it on the internet, at least the last time I did, there are apparently 64 different wars going on in the world. Now there's a lot of magnitude to that number in and of itself, but behind that they say that there are 600 different groups that are involved in these wars. So it's like 10 per war. It boggles my mind. How do you know who to shoot at? You shoot at somebody who might be your friend. But this is something that we know about. And this is just the tip of the iceberg version. But I'll tell you something, and you can tell me I'm wrong if you find that that's the case. In terms of the knowledge that we have as a humanity, scientific in all forms, in terms of the knowledge that we have at our disposal now, it is sufficient to solve every one of these problems. Every one of them. No new scientific theory needs to be developed. No new technology needs to come into being to address every single one of these. So, if that is in fact true, then it causes me to ask another question. And that question is, why isn't it occurring? Why are these problems not only still here, but growing? Why? So, what it tells me is this, that in terms of knowledge, knowledge is not enough. It's not enough. The fact that you know more does not affect the way that it's applied. And if you want an example, how do we approach violence on a massive scale? A war, for instance. Somebody jumps up and says we're going to war. What's the approach to that on the level of consciousness at which this problem is created? The approach is, in order to address war and violence, you bring to bear an even greater force of violence. So this is the solution to war. I mean, in World War I, the slogan was that it was the war to end all wars. Did it work? No. Starvation, you find starvation arises at various times in different parts of the world. And what's the solution on that level of consciousness where this problem is created? Throw food at it. So the world comes together, in genuine generosity, and supplies massive amounts of food, and the problem goes down to arise someplace else. So at the level that these problems are created, there's no solution. Basically, you're rearranging the furniture. Same room. Another example that might apply to us as Theosophists. In terms of the way that our understanding and approach to reality has sometimes been described by H.P.B. and by others, the word ignorance has been applied. And we are sometimes said to be profoundly ignorant of reality. You know, the whole idea of Maya is that's the world we function in, the world of illusion. We're profoundly ignorant of reality. So, as we come to that, and as we start to feel as if perhaps we are in fact missing something, what is our approach? How do we approach that as theosophists, as human beings? The normal approach is, well, I'm ignorant because I don't know enough. So what I need to do is I need to know more. So I'll switch the books, more and different things. Same process, just different materials. And we expect that this is something that is going to be transformative of our consciousness. But it's not. You know, even in our theosophical groups, some of you probably in England don't have this experience. But there are sometimes frictions within our theosophical groups. I know you're immune to that. But then again, maybe not. So, on the level at which these problems are created, there is no solution. Knowledge is not sufficient. It's necessary, of course, but it's not sufficient to the problems, any of the problems that face us. So what is? And, you know, probably if we were to describe it, it's something more along the lines of inspiration or wisdom, which are not even related to what we conceive of as knowledge. It's the difference between, in theosophical terminology, manas and buddhi. It's the difference, complete different in terms of the planes of consciousness on which we function. And so the idea then becomes, there are a lot of ways we can address the problems we face from moment to moment and day to day. You can choose among them. You know, if you find that you have an upset stomach, you can take an antacid pill. That's one solution. Or you can stop eating what you're eating. Change it. I mean, those are two different approaches to the exact same problem. But basically, I think if we're going to try and think more deeply, if we're going to push ourselves to go a little bit more beneath the surface, probably what we're looking for is something that is lasting. Something that addresses causes in place of mere symptoms. And so that's the direction that I think we should point our attention. And so really, again, it comes down to this realm of the world of wisdom. I should say, in terms of ignorance, one of the examples that is the classic example that you encounter about ignorance is, first of all, ignorance is not knowing. It's not that we don't know. It's that everything that we think we know wrongly. And so the example that they always give is this, of a man who's walking down a road in the evening. And as he's walking down the road, he looks up ahead of him, and he sees right in the middle of the road, he sees a snake coiled in the middle of the road. And seeing that snake, I have to mention snake because I don't want to feel like I don't want to feel like I'm an outsider. I don't have anything to say about Hitler. I don't know anything about, I don't have the dreams about crocodiles, so I'm going to throw in a snake here, Dave. So excuse me for stepping into your territory, Dave. A snake coiled in the middle of the road. And what's the response of someone who sees that? Their blood pressure rises, their heart starts beating, adrenaline pumps, and fear is there. Fight or flight is what arises within the person. But then they say, suppose that as he comes a little bit closer, because he has to go down the road, as he comes a little bit closer to it, he sees that actually it's not a snake. It's a rope that's coiled, that somebody had laid, and it's coiled in the middle of the road. Then what happens to the person's consciousness? Fear goes away. The adrenaline drops because you have perceived reality as it is, and you don't make it into something that it's not. That's the example that's always given. I always thought it was a very cute example. Growing up in New York City and then moving to Chicago, I never did have the experience of seeing many snakes in the road. Maybe in London you don't have that experience either. So I always thought it was very, very nice until I started to live in India. And I found myself and they have snakes at the Adyar campus at the international headquarters. I found myself walking down the road on my way to the dinner. And I was walking, I wasn't thinking about anything in particular, but I looked ahead, and what did I see? A snake coiled in the middle of the road. I said, oh my God. But I was a little bit aware, and so I didn't, turn on my heel and run. I said, well, I'm going to get this together, and I'm going to walk. But I walked very gingerly. I was walking, and I was looking. And as I got closer, I found that it wasn't a snake. It was, in fact, the roots of a tree that looked to me like a snake. Only then did I really get the full import of that expression, of that teaching tool about what ignorance does in our minds. So, what I'd like to offer, probably for the duration of the time that I'm going to be talking, is this. Within the Theosophical Society, very often, within Theosophy, and as it is expressed through the Theosophical Society, very often there is the sense that we're long on theory, short on practices. That's often expressed. I think it's incorrect, but it's something where certainly within the Theosophical approach there are no prescribed practices, although there are many approaches that are presented that can be applied. But from my point of view, the Theosophical Society as we know it, and Theosophy as we know it, had its representation to the world in 1875 through the work of HPB primarily, and others. Blavatsky was under no illusions about how readily these profound ideas were going to be accepted by the people she was speaking to. She knew they would not be. And she was very clear about that. Her expression was that this could not even be intelligently discussed until the next century, the 20th century. So what they came to do, and the effort, was really a matter of planting certain seeds in the human consciousness, transformative seeds, but seeds that were not yet ready to bloom and to grow, that needed the development of a certain sort of scientific point of view that has matured since then. It needed many things before these seeds could actually bear some sort of meaningful fruit. And so what were those seeds? And because I think that each one of them was something that had a profound potency, and also it's something that we do in fact find ourselves on the cusp of this time of reaping from these seeds that have been planted. This is my belief. In all of the indications I see in the world around me today, that's something that I think is an accurate assessment. So what were the seeds, and what is their practical value? So for me, I feel a little bit theosophically inadequate because I only came up with 5. And you have to have 7. I mean, you know that. So future lives, I'll get 6 and 7, but 5 seeds that came in and that are actually tools that are usable here and now in our daily lives. Although they can sometimes seem quite profound and out of reach, we can break it down. So the very first of those, and the most important, I would say, is this seed idea, which can in fact become an experience of unity, of oneness. This idea that was expressed in the first object as to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood. Oneness. It was an idea when it was presented that was, the brotherhood concept was totally out of step with the 1875 times. At that time it was a colonial era. Brotherhood was not on the charts. In order to be a colonial force, you have to have a sense of superior and inferior. It's required. Otherwise, there's no way of justifying, even if it's just military superiority. But of course, those things always bleed into cultural superiorities, religious superiorities. So, brotherhood unity was an idea that the world was not quite yet ready for, but it was the insistence that this is the prime focus of the Theosophical Society. It's the prime reason that these messages, it's the prime reason that this teaching is being re-exposed to humanity, to form these sorts of linkages, to recognize, to strip away some of the ignorance that tells us that in fact they don't exist, that we're separate. So how does this work in terms of a practical side of things? There's a quote from The Voice of the Silence, that little bitty book, that probably a couple of lifetimes it's going to take us to digest some portion of it. But there's one that really sort of worked my mind for 40 years. It's one that I've grappled with, that I have tried to understand at deepening sorts of levels. It's this, the quotation is this. It's about compassion. Compassion is no attribute. It is the law of laws. Compassion is no attribute, it's the law of laws. So that's a sweeping statement. I know of a lot of laws. They stopped me for a speeding ticket the other day. That's one I know for sure. But there are many other laws. Gravity is a law. Karma is a law. Cyclicity, these are laws. But compassion is the law of laws? How? Why? What's behind that? And so what I found myself arriving at is this. Generally, when we think of compassion, it's expressed in terms of the actions that are taken. So a compassionate act is an act that is taken to relieve the suffering of another or of others. And that's generally where our concept of compassion stops. And it's accurate. Certainly that part is true. It is compassionate to relieve another's suffering. But that doesn't rise to the law of laws because you're hungry and I feed you. But what it is this. When you think in terms of what it is that happens when we act compassionately toward another, the basic requirement is that you somehow or another, in consciousness, you connect yourself with another. First of all, you perceive a need. That need is described as a suffering. And in an outgoing sort of way, you use whatever your means are to attempt to relieve that. And by that process, you expand. No longer is it just you sitting here, but now it's you also encompassing this other. You live and you experience in this expanded sort of way. So this is this expansion. What was once a separative sort of individual now becomes something greater. And when you think in terms of those beings that we describe as the great ones, the main characteristic that we ascribe to them is that there is in fact no separation between them and there is no sense of otherness, that all consciousness is perceived, is embraced, is embodied within theirs. There's no separation. So when we think of compassion taken to its logical sort of extremes, Compassion is the law of oneness. It's the law of unity when it becomes not an act, but an experience. But we come to experience it through action. And so the practice that deepens and that brings about the flourishing of the seed within us is the practice of compassionate acts. And it's an antidote to many problems. I mean, I used to have sometimes I'd come back and I'd have a busy day, somebody didn't treat me the way I'm supposed to be treated, and you get back home and it's one of those days. And you can sit there and you can stew about it, and you can really think of the many ways that you've been done wrong and how you really need to be treated better than this. All of the different things that we can do in our minds. I would sometimes get into that mode and I say, okay, here's what I got to do. And I'd go and I'd cook a meal and invite someone over to eat. Or if it was snowing, in Chicago it does that a lot, I'd get my shovel, put it over my shoulder and go dig out my neighbor's stairs. I didn't knock on their door and say, I'm going to. And do you know? I'd come back and I'm feeling better. Compassion of this sort, it is an antidote to loneliness, which is pandemic in the world today. The world is urban population. You don't know this, I know. You're some of the most intelligent people around. I'll bet you don't know this, and somebody raise their hand if you did. I'm not sure of the exact year. I think it was 2007. Historic event took place. First time this particular thing had occurred in human history, never before. And the event was this. They don't know exactly where it happened or at what point or who was the cause, but what happened was this. At some point, some person from the village walked into the city, or at some point, someone living in a city had one more child, and at that point, for the very first time in human history, urban population exceeded the population of people in the country. More than 50% of all people live in cities, in concentrated urban clusters. And it's something that's expanding exponentially now. In the next 30, 40 years, it'll be 80% of the people are living in cities. There's cities popping up I didn't even know existed. I mean, have you ever heard of the city of Chengdu? Probably some of you have. I had never heard of it, and probably most of you had not. When I was going to Tibet that time, we passed through Chengdu. It's a city of 11 million people. Bigger than London, Chicago, New York. I hadn't even heard of the place. But these cities are they're creating cities of over 1 million people, just as we sit here and as we speak. So we have this high concentration of people in close proximity to one another. This is causing a lot of problems as well. But one of the problems that you would think it would not cause is a sense of isolation and loneliness, but it is. People in cities feel more cut off, more alone, more lonely than the people who have, a mile between their nearest neighbor. So this sort of principle of unity in action counteracts these things. And you try it for yourself. All of these things I'm saying, I'm presenting to you to attempt in a very scientific basis. Experiment. This is the hypothesis. This works. Experiment and find out for yourself. And then when we meet again, you tell me I'm wrong or right. But try it. And really, another factor in a lot of this, we've formed habits over lifetimes, not just in this lifetime. The whole idea of samskaras is the idea of habits that follow us from life to life. And so we've formed these habits, but in order to form a habit in this life, it only takes 30 days to form a new habit. So if this compassionate activity is something that appeals to you, don't try it once and say, I didn't feel happier. Give it 30 days. Any of these things. So that's one thing, unity. And that's the most important. If you do nothing else, if you hear nothing else, that's the one that you want to point to. the second seed that came through to us through the modern day presentation of Theosophy was the idea of multidimensionality. We are multi-dimensional beings, and in the Theosophical approach we tend to think in terms of 7 planes of being. Multi-dimensional beings in a multi-dimensional universe. And so, again, that's something that can be experimented with. We're aware. Minimal sort of self-awareness. You touch your hand, you feel a sensation. So at the level of the physical, there are sensations that we're aware of. And we can focus on these things ever more deeply. I mean, there are people who can feel nerve currents running through their bodies. You can. You could feel your heart beating, the blood pumping. So at very many levels, we become aware of the senses. That's the physical realm. But we also have these other bodies or these other dimensions within which we function. A lot of people pay very close attention to their dreams, because in dreams you have this mixture of the desire nature and the mental nature, and you can track those. You can experience these different dimensions of our being so that you can become aware and you can actually function intelligently in those. And again, it applies because the problems that are created in the physical realm are not solved at the realm of consciousness where it's created. We have to move up. The problems that we have of an emotional nature are not solved by shifting various emotions around. It's caused by lifting up. If we have no experience or no acquaintance with these other dimensions of our own being, then we're fairly inadequate to the problems that we face. So it requires a certain awareness that can be attained through simple practice and attention. And then, the sort of possibilities for inspiration, the possibilities to actually quiet the bodies or the aspects of the personality that are continually throwing up noise, is also a possibility to us. And in that way we experience higher dimensions that are generally not accessible to us except in momentary flashes. So multi-dimensionality was this other seed that has been planted. And it's something that's also now being explored scientifically. So if science says it's all right, it must be. So the third thing is the idea that there is no empty space. No empty space. And right now we sit in this room, and because there's this kind of seeming distance between us, we think of that as something that's somehow empty. But just like this is a multi-dimensional universe, it is also an intelligent universe filled with forms that express intelligence, some of which are seen to us, some of which are not. Tim was talking the other day about the elemental kingdoms, which are one of the lower kingdoms. But in the Mahatma letters, there's this beautiful term. I love even to just say it because it's such a wonderful expression. They talk about how from moment to moment, every one of us is continually peopling our current in space. Now you tell me that's not a beautiful expression. Peopling our current in space. There is this current that is continually flowing out from us of thoughts, of emotions, and occasionally of things higher. And in this current, it has the effect of attracting to it these other sort of intelligent forms that resonate with these various sorts of levels of energies that come from us. So angry, have you ever been around, you've been around an angry person. I mean, what's the response? Basically, when you're around someone who is angry, self-protection is what happens. And angry people tend to incite anger in others. Have you ever been around someone who is depressed? You can sit around someone, and if you're not careful, you'll walk out feeling just completely drained of energy. You never touched the person. How is this possible? I mean, obviously, it's something that we know, but we need to really know it in order for it to become effective in us. There was an old guy that I knew in Chicago. He was quite well known. I felt people would come to him from around the world to seek his counsel because he was a very psychic man. So he really could talk about a lot of things. But he said, it's good to know, but it's much better to know and to know you know. And there's a dramatic difference between knowing and being in that position of the higher self that actually knows what you know. So this is one of those things that also, there is no empty space, and from moment to moment, the thoughts that are coming out from us are shaping, are attracting the sorts of forces that become active to us and we experience as, our daily life. And we either infect others with or bless others with. So that's another thing. The fourth thing would be the idea that we are self-responsible. We are responsible for ourselves. There is no outer power. There is no higher power that dictates the way that we function and the experience that we have in our lives. In the little book, Idol of the White Lotus, at the end there's this thing that is called the Three Truths. Beautiful expression again. And about this idea of self-responsibility, it says each man is his own ultimate lawgiver, the dispenser of glory or gloom to himself, the creator of your life, your reward, and your punishment. Each one of us is continually in this process by the choices that we make from moment to moment. I mean, the same idea of peopling our current in space is the same thing that we can choose how we can choose that population that comes with us everywhere we go. And this is it's a responsibility. But it's really only a responsibility once you know it. Most people walk around complaining that, life is doing them wrong somehow, and they base it on the fact that they don't know any better. Now, if you don't know any better, then it really does look as if life is treating you badly. But if you do, there is an option, a very practical option, that to not apply it and then to keep on walking through, then it's your own fault. Nobody to blame. Which is not the same as saying that bad things don't happen to good people. They do all the time. I mean, this Rinpoche that I started out talking to you about, his profound evil was that he was a Tibetan Buddhist in Tibet at a time when the Chinese took over. And so he ended up in prison and tortured for 20 years. But a lot of people would, that experience would mark them with how unfair this world is, not him. So, self-responsibility is this other seed that has been planted in these teachings that H.P. Blavatsky and others brought to us. And then the last one, the fifth one, would be the idea of spiritual evolution. It's a profound idea. I mean, it's the basis for this whole possibility of the masters of the wisdom, of the Buddha, of the Jesuses, of the Krishnas, of the ascended sorts of beings. That there is, in fact, within us the soul, and again, referring to the idol of the White Lotus, the soul of man is immortal, and its future is the future of a thing whose growth and splendor has no limit. That's the essential nature of each and every human being. Growth and splendor is limitless. So these are 5 ideas. And I present them because I do believe it's something that's quite foundational to the work of the Theosophical Society. And also I present them because I tried to present them in a way that is actually practice-based. Because really I do feel that however profound the idea, unless there is some avenue for application, it falls short of the need, and particularly the need of this moment. HPB and others lived toward a world that did not exist as yet. They lived, they suffered, they taught, they wrote toward a future generation of people who could perhaps grasp these things and turn it into something more than a system of concepts. That's the responsibility that we have. And the reason why it's something that is really tuned to this time, it's an unfortunate characteristic of humanity, I do believe. It's not always necessarily the case, but it does seem that we as human beings are much more prone to learn and to respond in crisis rather than when the sun is shining and times are good. It's an unfortunate feature. Before I came here, just before I came here, I was at there's an organization called IONS, Institute of Noetic Sciences, and they had asked me to speak to their group. They have that annual convention. But prior to that, I was talking with a woman, very profound woman, and she's doing a lot of very good work. But the idea came up to me when World War II began in the United States. It began with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So the planes came over, bombed the ships, and then America was at war. It was not something that this country was ready for a war. It hadn't planned for the war, but it took a grand total of 3 days to put the entire nation on a footing to address this crisis, this very severe crisis that had arisen 3 days before. The rationing, all of the sorts of things with the lights going out at different times. The nation was put on a footing in 3 days' time. Why? Because of a severe crisis. That's not the only way we can learn. And the hope for us as Theosophists, it really does not take a huge population to shift this climate, to shift this mental climate that is so addicted to war, to lack, to limitation, to aggrandizement of self. It doesn't take a huge population to affect a change. But unless it happens in those who are blessed in this particular lifetime with having come across and having found value in something like Theosophy, where is it going to happen? I mean, it will happen, obviously. But it would be nice, you know, when the history books look back and they say, oh, those Theosophists brought us into this new time. We knew they would. So anyway, that's why I offer this. I think there are an awful lot of things we can talk about, many subjects that are interesting and important. But when we get right down to it, there's probably about one subject that makes a difference right now, and that's what is it that you and what is it that I am going to do to apply these things and to make it not merely a teaching, but an experience that can be communicated. So I want to thank you for spending a little time with me. It was fun. Don't clap. Shh.
We've got a few minutes, and Tim says he would welcome some questions. So, is there anybody who has a question?
Use the microphone.
Are there any questions?
you consider meditation a practical tool that's very essential to make this 5 seats more real in our life somehow?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, meditation is a tool that applies to all of those. And I should say, too, that even with, just for the purposes of being able to consider these things, we divide them, so 5. But it would be mistaken to think that in some way they're separate from one another. Unity, by virtue of being one without a second, applies to multidimensionality, to no empty space, to self-responsibility. They all inter-apply. But in all of this, of course, meditation is always probably one of the most valued tools that can be brought to bear on it. So, yeah.
Do you think that it will take some sort of catastrophic event or series of events for humanity to really assess what it's about and to understand its mission?
The answer to that question is probably above my pay grade. Obviously, I can speculate just as well as the next person, but what I prefer to do is to think in terms of those possibilities which cause the least suffering and the maximum transformation. And now, as in every other time, those possibilities are here and we can avail ourselves of those. So that's the direction that I tend to put my energy in that direction. Obviously, if it happens differently, it doesn't change so much my approach, but it would sort of work against what my wish is.
Would you think that Theosophy could be taught to children?
Oh, it is. Oh, it definitely is. I mean, here's one way that we teach it. Again, I laid out these 5 things, and speaking to an audience that is, above the age of children at least. I mean, some of us are headed toward that second one, but above the age of children. What is it that we do when we're with our children? My daughter, who will be here in a couple of days, she's no theosophist. She's been around it all her life. She's no theosophist in the sense that she's not attracted to sit here and have a one-way conversation happen, someone talking at her. But in terms of the ideas and in terms of the way they have been involved in her own life, she's got it. So which would I prefer? The eloquence of quotation or the eloquence of having to be able to live these sorts of things? And how is it taught? There's an expression that who you are speaks so loudly, people can't hear a word that you're saying. We teach by being, and we also supply ideas. So all of these things, we are continually teaching. Another fact of the spiritual life is this. It is inevitable. Anybody who embraces a spiritual path in earnest must necessarily become a healer. Necessarily. It's unavoidable. It doesn't mean, you're rubbing your hands together, and maybe you do. But it means that in your presence, others become whole. The consciousness, in the biblical example, Jesus walked through and someone touched the hem of his garment and was made whole. When we walk through, the garment that we wear, the garment of consciousness, the garment of the aura that surrounds us, touches others, and others are made whole, or at least a little happier. So we're constantly doing this, and children are getting it. I think what your question is, though, really is, can this be done in an organized sort of format? And even that's being done. sometime you need to invite Vic Hao Chin to come and to give the Blavatsky lecture or to give some other series of talks. He's doing it in the Philippines where they have a series of schools and they teach not just theosophical ideas, but actual tools to address these sorts of push-button emotional issues and mental issues that we all have inside of us, to diffuse them. So it's a very practical teaching. So yes, the short answer is yes. My friend here would like, no, go ahead.
First of all, thanks for this inspiring talk. Could you say something about self-compassion?
Self-compassion, yeah. One of the, in Buddhism, there's this idea of may all beings have happiness. They call this thing the four immeasurable minds. And the first of those minds is, may all beings have happiness, and the cause is, may all beings be free from suffering, and on and on. So what people generally do is they sit down in their meditation, and in some way they try and visualize all beings, and try and visualize the understanding and the wisdom that would make them whole and happy flowing out through us. The one being that they leave out. So there is the need for self-healing. I mean, that doesn't mean you can't heal prior to being completely cured and whole yourself. But we need to actually focus on those and use the tools that are available. And in all things, there's a lot of work being done now at the academic level, at the medical level, with this idea of forgiveness. And how do we forgive? And some people say forgive and forget. That's ridiculous. That's 100% ridiculous. How are you going to forget? But the issue is that we are able, in fact, to develop our consciousness in such a way that we don't forget, but we remember differently. We remember differently. And that's a possibility that applies to the body as well as to the mind.
Yes, Tim. With a new international Western approach president, how do you think you'll be able to take the whole Theosophical movement forward into the future?
Next question. You're very unfair. Can I do this? I'm not going to say I will not speak to that question, but can we talk about, because they're actually going to be talking about the future of the Theosophical movement in a couple of days. Can we hold it? And hopefully by then you'll forget.
I think we've got time for one more question.
See, now if you join the Theosophical Society, you'll get the microphone.
I understand in America, Theosophy plays a role in sort of interface and the ecumenical side of acting as a way of bringing various sort of religious things together. I'm not aware so much, and correct me if I'm wrong, that over here in Europe we don't tend to do that from a theosophical point of view. Is that something? Because I find these days talking to people who have a particular religious background, Christian background or whatever, are becoming very disillusioned with their faith. They want more knowledge. And something like Theosophy is obviously the perfect vehicle. So whether that's something we ought to start investigating and learning from the states in that sense.
Well, we do have interreligious sorts of attempts. I wouldn't, as much as I would like to brag, that I wouldn't be able to say that that's something that we're particularly good at. We try it. I think generally what you get is a lot of people stress this idea of tolerance, which tolerance can be a very tepid sort of frame of mind. It basically means that I don't really believe in what you do, but I'll tolerate it. So there's some degree of that, but we have events where you have a variety of religious people who come together, sharing the things that are most meaningful in that faith. And generally it relates to prayer. So interreligious prayer, because that cuts across all borders. And those tend to work out well. We've made a number of friends in the variety of communities. And people, basically the idea is to try and root this consciousness, again, of unity. That all of the religions are talking about a state of consciousness that is available to every single person that breathes. And to the extent that that can be something that's highlighted, it's successful. We continue to try that. And I think it's a good thing to focus on. It's not, again, I wouldn't say that we're the ones that you want to write the book about on how well we do it. Yeah. I shouldn't be so honest, should I?
We do have an example here of the Peace Father.
Yeah.
And that's very much so, bringing together the
Sure.
various faiths together. And,
It's the hardest aspect of the project.
absolutely.
Thank you.